Metroid was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System on August 6, 1986. This game doesn't need much of an introduction because it's almost certain that if you found this video, you are at least familiar with this game. For brevity's sake, I'm just going to refer to this game as Metroid for the rest of this video. My first exposure to this game was in 2010, playing the unlockable version that came with connecting Metroid Prime to Metroid Fusion. I went in with a blank slate since I didn't use the internet much back then, and barely anyone at my middle school had ever even heard of Metroid. As I played through the game for the first time, I unknowingly found myself in a situation that I think most of us are very familiar with. Things like wondering, why can't I shoot downward? Where is my map? Why does the beam stop in midair? Despite these oddities, I was no stranger to NES jank, ended up making about as far as beating Kraid before I felt completely lost. I eventually gave up and came back later with the NIR password code. That and an online guide made Metroid a much easier experience for me at the time. At the time, I still enjoyed the game well enough, but I've also come around to a more mixed perspective overall. I don't think it's an unplayable mess, but I also don't think it's an underrated masterpiece. Once again, the internet seems to enjoy taking two extremes. So to put it lightly, Metroid has somewhat of a controversial reputation amongst fans. I'd like to take a closer look at Metroid, and I hope to see if I can identify why people feel the way that they do about this game. One thing about this video that I'd like to clarify right away is that I'm simply not interested in giving this game the benefit of viewing it from the perspective of its time period. I wasn't even alive in 1986, and while I do think there's validity in viewing games in the context of their release, that's simply not the goal of this video. I intend to examine this game with the perspective of someone playing it in 2023, and I intend to compare this game directly to the rest of the series whenever I please. I'm looking at the game for what it is now, not what it was then. We've all heard the story about how Metroid set the standard for the series and was massively innovative, and I don't intend on taking those achievements away from this game, but those achievements are not relevant to the kind of discussion I'm interested in having. Metroid has a remarkably simple story. If we set aside everything we know about the sequel games, we're left with a basic good guys versus bad guys story. Bounty hunter Samus Aran has been hired by the Galactic Federation Police to exterminate a space pirate leader at their home base. Before the events of the game, the space pirates have stolen a newly discovered and extraordinarily dangerous organism called a Metroid. This tremendous new threat to the galaxy must be eliminated, and it's up to the player character, Samus, to put a stop to the bad guys. Most of the story, like most NES games, was found in the manual rather than the game itself. Unlike most other NES games, however, the manual offers a surprising amount of lore. This paragraph on the title screen is all that players had to go off of from the game itself. Because of the simplicity of the actual plot, this story makes a great introduction to the Metroid series and is accessible to newcomers. I appreciate the simplicity to this game's story, and it stands out even today for this reason. Metroid is playing to the strengths of its open design by sticking to a simple and minimal story. But as a result, the story doesn't really do much or go anywhere super interesting. Looking at the story for what it is, it sufficiently contextualizes gameplay and does its job well. The simple premise doesn't directly tell us much about our player character, but that doesn't necessarily make Samus a blank slate in this game. Video games have a wealth of opportunity to characterize their worlds and characters in many ways, and I believe that Metroid tells us more than you might initially suspect. Samus Aran, accepting a bounty hunting mission from the Federal Police, informs us a little on Samus herself. We may not know exactly what Samus thinks about the Federation or the space pirates, but it's clear that money is enough to motivate her to eliminate the latter on this dangerous mission. Perhaps she has other motives, or maybe she just loves collecting bounties. It's unclear if this mission carries any personal stakes with Samus, but her choice in occupation and her acceptance of such a high stakes and daunting task gives Samus a lot of the characteristics we've come to expect from a typical video game protagonist. Samus is adventurous, brave, capable, and this early on in the series, her own personal morality is unclear. Her agency is defined by her mission, and that she simply does what she is hired to do. But at the same time, Samus has chosen not to work directly for the Galactic Federation as an officer. She may value independence, and yet she has chosen to accept this specific mission. This hints that Samus's motivations, while not clear, may be a bit more personal than her mission being just business after all. The Federation has decided to trust Samus with taking care of this important mission, suggesting that Samus has earned herself a notable reputation. This reputation was more than likely earned from numerous bounties Samus has completed for the Federation in the past. In addition, Samus's power suit is immediately recognizable as a special piece of equipment. She might start off feeling underpowered, but her suit is capable of augmenting her abilities to extraordinary heights. Like I already went over, Samus is meant to be understood as a highly formidable combatant. Once the capabilities of the power suit are understood by the player, Samus's reputation becomes more believable. So as early as the very first game, there are at least hints of Samus being heroic, brave, uniquely and especially formidable, and one that seeks adventure. At the same time, Samus is hinted to possibly have personal reasons to fight the space pirates, as well as personal reasons to work for the Federation without directly working as a Federation police officer. Of course, there are many ways to interpret Samus's characterization in this game. New players often mistake Samus for an android after all. I do not doubt that my knowledge of the lore of the entire series influences my interpretation of this first game to some extent, but I think it's at least worth mentioning that even accounting for the other titles, the lore of this first game fits with the rest of the series surprisingly well. The mainstays of the series are introduced and characterized here in the very first game: the pirates, the Metroids, Planet Zebes, Samus, the Federation, and an unnamed mysterious ancient civilization. I think it's worth calling attention to and appreciating just how little has changed overall within the mythos of the Metroid series. Of course, the unnamed former inhabitants of Zebes would go on to be recontextualized into something far different from what was previously an entirely mysterious race, but we'll discuss that idea in other videos as it becomes relevant. For now, just examining what exists here in the first game, we know almost nothing of who these beings were, what happened to them, or what they were like. That certainly has its own appeal, and I think this mystery of Planet Zebes enhances the atmosphere in a compelling way. Even replaying this game today, with having experienced the entire series, I always feel there's something special about the way these mysterious beings are depicted specifically here in this first game. So little is known about them here, and it feels as though their absence could stretch back further than we could possibly know. The music in the statue rooms especially strongly contrasts these areas against the rest of the game world, with a focus on atmosphere over melody. Like I said in my previous video, I think sometimes less is more, and that's what makes the remnants of this unnamed race of bird-like warriors so compelling here in Metroid. Planet Zebes itself nails Metroid's winning formula very well, which is especially impressive for the very first game. Right away I have to call attention to the black backgrounds. It's not much, but the dark emptiness of the backgrounds helps reinforce the feeling of brave in an expansive and dim cave. The foregrounds have bright colors that pop against the backgrounds, and usually depict what appear to be alien-made structures integrated into the stone walls, platforms, and floors. These statues are placed into the world design alongside other things like the doors, pipes, metallic blocks, and brick structures. Through any door, the design of the environment could switch from a cave to something completely different, like a massive underground structure with all kinds of winding pathways filled with acid pits, for example. There's a marriage of natural and unnatural here that should sound familiar to any fan of the Metroid series. So once again, Metroid is setting the foundation for the series at large remarkably well. Regardless of where you are, however, the wildlife of the planet has made their homes everywhere. Natural life carries a strong presence in nearly every single room in this game, which further reinforces the idea that the mysterious ancient race had disappeared a long time ago. The design of the enemy creatures clearly takes inspiration from many real-life insects, which many people are afraid of. Despite living among us, the insect world feels entirely foreign, or perhaps alien, to us. So Metroid is playing with concepts like forgotten ancient civilizations, strange insectoid aliens, isolation, and a lack of overt player guidance. All of this reinforces a specific feeling that's now widely recognized as one of the Metroid series' greatest defining features. Planet Zebes is dark, dangerous, mysterious, daunting, and unwelcoming. Overcoming all of this is a huge part of what Metroid is all about. Metroid is an early NES first-party release. To start with the positives, I think this game uses color fairly well. Like I said before, the colors pop and contrast well against the background to make the design language easy to understand. There is an aesthetic appeal in the environments and many of the enemy sprites. I also think the animation is sufficient in communicating the right ideas to the player and making the world feel more real than it otherwise would. Different levels carry different colors, and it makes for a suitable visual variety moving from level to level. On a per-level basis, however, much of the visuals are repetitive. This doesn't just come from the often repeated level layouts, however, but also just from the same tile textures and colors being repeated as often as they are within each level. Despite this game's small size, it feels like the game could benefit from just a bit more going on with the art direction of the environments. As for Samus's sprites, to put it bluntly, I think they are genuinely bad. I'm far from the first to point any of this out, but her proportions are completely off, and her sprites simply mirror when facing the opposite way. I don't know how else to put my thoughts on Samus's art design, other than simply saying it is the least pleasant sprite to look at in the whole game. I strongly prefer to play as Samus without the suit for the simple reason that the sprites are drawn much better. Other sprites here and there kind of look iffy, such as the lava and acid textures having no animation. Overall, I'm quite positive on the creature designs, especially the Metroids and little zoomers. Even considering the fact that this game was released on the NES, we know that the NES's capable of much better looking visuals with more detailed animations and backgrounds, as well as better use of color and visual set dressing. It's quite rare to find any foreground objects beyond the occasional bush here and there in Metroid, and the simplistic and repetitive level design only make the lacking art direction stand out that much more. I wouldn't call anything other than Samus' sprites outright bad, but I think this is easily the worst looking game in the series, even accounting for when it was released and the platform it was released on. Lacking, unappealing, but far from bad and plenty to appreciate overall. You'd think there'd not be too much to say about an NES game's controls, but Metroid has a surprising amount of depth here. A and B are your standard jump and shoot, and the D-pad aims up or to each side. Similar to Mario, Samus can jump higher by holding the jump button for longer. Additionally, however, Samus can perform one of two different kinds of jumps. If Samus jumps while standing still, she'll do a normal jump. This jump seems to have a greater vertical acceleration and greater degree of control. If Samus jumps while she is moving, she will instead do a somersault. The somersault has a greater horizontal acceleration and is slightly more slippery. One is generally more useful for vertical platforming, while the other is better for horizontal platforming. Having these different jumps available and being able to adjust the height works well for different scenarios and makes for more dynamic platforming. Samus' movement otherwise is mostly exactly as you'd expect from an NES game. It's perfectly sufficient for this kind of game, though there isn't much going on outside of the jumping and shooting. The real issue comes in when performance is factored in. Metroid frequently suffers from a wealth of technical issues, such as hitbox jank, sprite rendering errors such as flickering and discoloration, and most of all, lots and lots of slowdown. The slowdown of this game is certain to happen anytime there are enough enemies on the screen, and this is a very frequent issue. The controls become sluggish as well, which makes precise movement a nuisance. There are other control quirks as well, such as the three-way aiming, but I'll delve into that more when talking about combat. Sound is interesting because this game has an alternative set of music and sound effects depending on which regional version you play. This is because Metroid was released on the Famicom Disk System in Japan, which had more advanced sound hardware when compared to the NES. I'll play a little of each to allow viewers to decide for themselves which they might prefer. For me, I generally prefer the Famicom music, but it's also a bit of a case-by-case scenario. Brinstar is the most adventurous sounding track, which works well as an introductory piece to the adventure. Norfair is distinctly more dangerous. Ridley is both unsettling and unpleasant. Torian is especially ominous and dangerous. Kraid, however, is one of the best tracks in the entire series. A lot of the level tracks have a general sense of foreboding and danger, which certainly complements the narrative and gameplay. Other tracks outside of the gameplay are worth appreciating as well, such as the iconic title screen with what would become the main theme of the series. One thing I really like about each title screen of the series is that different games will do something unique with this theme that reflects the game somehow. In the case of this first Metroid game, the title screen music will change to this dramatic and adventurous segment. The other notable track outside of the gameplay is the credits theme, which is perhaps my favorite credits music in any game ever. And last, but far from least, is the escape music. So in addition to the great full music tracks, Metroid also has a few little fanfare pieces that play for special events, like starting a game or collecting an item. Everyone who has played Metroid is familiar with this, but I would still like to play these to provide an opportunity to appreciate just how outstanding they are. As for the item acquired fanfare, I actually might prefer the NES version. The last of Metroid's sound to discuss is the sound effects. I think it's really easy for me to say that I prefer the NES version's sound effects over the Famicom's. Neither are particularly outstanding to me, but the sound effects work well to provide feedback to the player. It's actually pretty difficult for me to think of much to say about these sound effects. 8-bit sound effects are charming in their own way, but they tend to leave a lot to the imagination. Some stand out more than others, such as the screw attack and bomb sound effects. As far as world design is concerned, the number of pathways available changes as the game continues. Every Metroid game starts off with only 1 or 2 pathways, but the first Metroid is the quickest to start opening up. Your one path becomes more than 6 as soon as you grab the Morph Ball. 3 additional areas open up to you once you get missiles, and then nearly the entire map opens to you once you get bombs. Most of the map is open to you once you get Ice Beam or High Jump, and Torian opens once you defeat the 2 bosses. So for better or for worse, the world opens up very quickly. One look at the map makes it obvious that there are countless branching pathways, loops, and a wealth of opportunity to get lost. This is actually the smallest map in the series, and yet the world layout is a sprawling maze. With bombs, you can go nearly everywhere, but figuring out how you're going to get there is a whole other conversation. The world is open in that almost all of it is available to you. Yes, but this game is far from an open world. The convoluted level design will demand you to account for your surroundings and demonstrate your navigational skills in order to beat this game. I believe that Metroid's world design is exactly as linear as it needs to be, and by this metric is excellently designed. This game has basically no difficulty curve as a result of its world and progression design. It can't tell much of a story, and it can't predict when you'll be where. There are plenty of consequences to this freedom, but also numerous benefits as well. Metroid as a series is notable for trusting the player to figure things out on their own, and this makes for a compelling challenge that places you in a similar headspace to the player character. Both you and Samus are dropped in this dangerous world completely isolated, and it's up to you to make sense of and conquer the challenges presented to you. Isolation as a concept is narratively, thematically, and mechanically significant to Metroid's design, and this is a huge part of what makes Metroid my favorite series, period. This game never closes off older areas to the player, and you'll certainly find yourself backtracking to Brinstar to travel between it Norfair, Kraid, and Turian. The relatively minimal item progression of this game does mean that backtracking isn't often incentivized, because you really don't need to return with new items to old locations very often. You can backtrack anywhere at any time, but the game doesn't really ask you to do this in order to make progress, because you'll have nearly every item required within the first half hour or so. This freedom to backtrack whenever you please does come at a potential cost, and that a player may falsely conclude that they found a dead end, but we'll discuss that potential issue more later. Metroid is linear in some ways, but it also isn't. You must collect specific items in a set order, and you must defeat the bosses before you can enter Turian. All the in-between is left to the player to sort out, but there is some amount of linearity in the item and event progression at the very least. I can appreciate what Metroid offers in its more open design, but I also can't help but find this game just a little less interesting than some of the other games in some ways as a result. In the first Metroid, there are less opportunities to demonstrate knowledge of your arsenal and utilize your abilities in an item logistical manner to benefit your navigation. This is simply inherent to the lesser focus on item progression. It's a double-edged sword that will appeal to some and off-put others. I find myself somewhere in between, but I find lots to enjoy when it comes to mixing up the item order, as well as trying to skip some items to further challenge myself. No other Metroid will offer such a wealth of opportunity for variation in item ordering on repeat playthroughs. As you likely already know, Metroid's gameplay was conceptualized as a marriage of Mario's action and platforming with Zelda's exploration-focused, interconnected world. It's important to understand that Metroid's very foundation is to balance these aspects to lesser or greater lengths, so that the lateral scale gameplay and more immediate gameplay are both well designed. Neither Metroid's larger scale exploration and progression, nor the moment-to-moment action platforming is exactly like the respective games each design drew inspiration from. In other words, Metroid doesn't do action quite like Mario, nor does it do exploration quite like Zelda. To start with action, Samus simply must defeat or evade enemies and platform over various hazards. Metroid's action is easily understood because it's nothing remarkable or unique, which is completely fine. Enemies are dispatched usually with your projectile beam weapon, but also with other abilities like bombs, the screw attack, or your high damage but limited missiles. Regardless of whether you decide to defeat enemies or go around them, you will engage in spending resources like health points and missile ammunition in order to further your exploration. Very self-explanatory. On the other side of this gameplay coin is exploration. Your exploration isn't quite like Zelda's, mainly because you are required to collect specific items in order to reach other items. This design is perhaps similar to the raft item from Zelda being required to reach the 4th dungeon. What's interesting is that here in the first Metroid, this item progression isn't nearly as prevalent as it would come to be in the future releases. Morph Ball, missiles, bombs, and Ice Beam are indeed required to beat the game, but every other item merely makes the game easier rather than being required. This means that Metroid's progression isn't solely defined by its items, but also defined by specific progression tasks, like these boss statues. In order to reach the final level, the player is required to defeat the 2 bosses in the game. So Metroid has both item progression and what I will call event progression. You're not going to complete the game without collecting specific items and completing specific events. So it's a combination of both, similar to how Zelda requires the Triforce pieces as well as specific items like the raft. In Metroid, only 2 progression events and 4 progression items are outright required to reach Turian. So what makes the first Metroid unique here is that the game requires very little in order to access the full map, even aside from sequence breaking. Item progression is indeed here in Metroid, but it's clearly in its infancy, as most other games in the series place a much greater focus on item progression. What this means is that Metroid NES feels very loose in its progression, in that you can really go anywhere as soon as you get the bombs, which happens to be, like I said before, in the first 30 minutes or so. There are plenty of optional upgrades to continue to search for, but high jump aside, each of those merely enhance your combative abilities rather than directly open your explorative area any further. So with a looser and lesser focus on item progression comes a smaller opportunity for sequence breaking. Sequence breaking, simply put, is the ability to break the predetermined sequence of progression, whether that be an item or event progression. Rearranging the order or outright skipping a sequence of events is common in many Metroid games, but it comes in a variety of flavors. Here in the first Metroid, our options are actually somewhat limited depending on how you define sequence breaking. I am of the opinion that in order for you to break a sequence, there of course must be a specific outline sequence in the first place. To better illustrate my point, you can either fight Kraid or Ridley first. Both are available to you as soon as you get bombs, and the game does not provide any indication of the intended boss order, nor any definitive path of least resistance. I feel that the boss order in Metroid is not outlined enough to call changing the boss order a sequence break. I would simply call this an alternate sequence. I could apply the same logic to many of the items like Wave Beam, Ice Beam, High Jump, or Screw Attack. Since all of these items can be collected in any order, these exist as alternate sequences rather than sequence breaks, at least by my described criteria. I think that defining a sequence break has everything to do with identifying the difficulty of the break and whether or not the item logic outlines a sequence in the first place. Every Metroid game has a fairly clear path of least resistance in which the ordering of progression items and events is mostly clear, but this first Metroid game doesn't really adhere to that design to the same extent. The only notable item sequence break that immediately comes to my mind is the one where you can collect the Varia suit without the high jump boots. This gap is too high to jump without the upgrade, but you can make this enemy follow you into this room and freeze it to platform your way to the door. Alternatively, you can clip yourself into this door in a specific way and execute some precise inputs to clip through the wall until you appear at the door above. Now, these two early Varia suit methods work well to illustrate an important aspect of sequence breaking in Metroid. Metroid generally has two main types of sequence breaking methods, and these two methods for early Varia illustrate the difference quite well. One method asks the average player to demonstrate their critical thinking skills and use their intuition to succeed in sequence breaking. The player must analyze the enemy behavior and properties of their moveset and abilities in order to put the puzzle pieces together to break the sequence. There is at least a case to be made that this could have been intended by the developers or intuited by the player. On the other hand, you have what I would call some of the most counterintuitive sequence of events that almost nobody would ever guess through conventional wisdom, and often utilize obscure exploits and glitches. These are almost always clearly not intended. The main deciding factor between the two is whether or not the sequence break could reasonably be intuitively discovered by someone not utilizing exploits and glitches. Generally speaking, both of these types of sequence breaks appeal to players in different ways. However, only intuitive sequence breaks can be intuited after all. A huge part of sequence breaking for me personally is discovering them for myself and experimenting with my arsenal in different parts of the game world. I'm less interested in following an online guide and more interested in seeing if I can find some of these myself. Intuitive sequence breaks offer a specific feeling of experimentation and discovery that simply isn't there with counterintuitive sequence breaks. I enjoy poking around the world with the opportunity to demonstrate my knowledge of my current moveset, the item logic, my pathing through the world, and experimenting to discover what may or may not be available to me at any specific time. At the same time, I also certainly enjoy learning tricks like the scan dash, out of bounds, or muckball. It's outstanding tricks like these that define a massive part of Metroid speedrunning culture, after all. But for all of their worth, these breaks aren't as interesting to me as the moments in Metroid where I can figure this stuff out for myself. Obviously, this is an especially highly opinionated aspect of this discussion, but regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, Metroid as a series offers an impressive variety of ways to challenge those interested in sequence breaking. At the very least, I think it's fair to say that the two main types of sequence breaks challenge different skill sets, and both are valid favorites. With that laid out, we can continue to discuss Metroid NES in particular. Two other notable potentially intuitive sequence breaks are being able to roll off this edge in Kraid's lair to reach Kraid without Ice Beam. Jumping out of Morph Ball in midair is fairly self-explanatory, but nonetheless useful for its relative ease and universal application. Platforming in general is improved by being able to gain this extra distance. The last and by far most difficult, potentially intuitive sequence break is having this enemy follow you into the statue room to use him as a platform to skip needing to defeat Kraid and Ridley. This trick is difficult and only done by speedrunners. You must then beat all of Torian without the massive number of missiles earned by defeating Kraid and Ridley. The skill ceiling is ludicrously high, and the only advantage offered is a tremendous and incredible time save, which obviously is everything to speedrunners. Having to brave Torian without all of those missiles is something I'm certainly not interested in, but it's outstanding to see that it can be done at all. The big counterintuitive sequence break that I'd like to mention in this video is what is widely known as door jumping. Door jumping is my previously described method of clipping through walls to go nearly anywhere. This can be used to sequence break even traveling through otherwise required chunks of levels, which is just absurd. The potential of this trick is absolutely staggering and makes for very entertaining speedruns. Other sequence breaks are beyond the scope of this video, but I recommend you check them out online if this kind of thing seems interesting to you. My greater point is that item ordering in general is perhaps the least linear that the series has ever seen. Sequence breaking in particular, however, isn't what you might initially suspect, since there's very little of an actual intended sequence in this game. The best way to describe this game's world layout is that it's like a giant continuous maze with many crossing and interconnected pathways. Rather than having a level select like Mega Man or Castlevania 3, Metroid has you physically moving yourself from level to level, which further immerses the player in this game world as a physical and, in a sense, real place. To keep the Zelda comparisons going, I'd say that Metroid is far more maze-like than Zelda, so much so that Planet Zebes is less like Hyrule and much more like one giant Zelda dungeon. You have your start point and your end point, but this maze must be solved by finding figurative keys and locks scattered throughout the game world. Players will need to account for their position within the maze-like world design and do a lot of backtracking through older areas to discover new pathways previously inaccessible. The game introduces backtracking to the player wordlessly at the very beginning by placing a tunnel to the player's right and the morph ball to the left, immediately defying conventions of the era to set expectations accordingly. A navigation-focused challenge should task the player to account for multiple pathways and make a mental effort to account for their surroundings. And it's up to the player to find the way forward within this puzzle box-like level design. The mental load that the player must account for is likely to increase exponentially as the world continues to open. When navigating this kind of world design, a player is attempting to offload and categorize as much information as they can to facilitate efficient navigation. So the greater number of pathways available to the player, as well as how obvious the dead ends are, has everything to do with difficulty balancing. The goal of any Metroidvania game should be to balance these design aspects alongside many more things as well. It's far more complicated than just what I'm discussing here, but it's at least a major component to make sure that dead ends aren't obvious, but also not too cryptic. It's also important for players to account for those dead ends and ask themselves specifically why they might not be able to use a certain pathway. Maybe there's a tunnel you can't fit into, perhaps something needs bombing, or maybe a jump is too high for you to make. So there is certainly a lot that plays into balancing the difficulty and level of engagement of this kind of world design. My larger point here is that there's a lot of nuance with designing these levels to balance challenging the player's navigation without wasting the player's time. To bring it back to this specific Metroid game, Metroid's greater world design manages to be maze-like enough to effectively challenge the player's world navigation. The number of pathways available to the player grows as the game continues, thus raising the difficulty of navigation as you progress. The number of pathways can be especially difficult to account for, since this game has no map feature. Looking at a world map, you can see that each individual level isn't as large or complex as you may have initially suspected without the map. The player's time is not wasted through the larger level layout itself at the very least. The only area of the world that genuinely seems to be built to waste the player's time is this odd section here at the top of Kraid's lair, but even this doesn't waste very much time. The world is so small and so interconnected that it doesn't take very long to get anywhere, which is something I am especially appreciative of. The greatest navigational challenge of Metroid is going to come from finding these little secret blocks that exist within each room more than the actual greater world layout. With world design thoroughly examined, I'd like to take a look at Metroid's moment-to-moment level design. I may have had a number of positive things to say about the macro-scale world design, but the micro-scale level design unfortunately does not bode nearly as well. Seeing as this is an NES game, we can expect some basic and blocky level layouts, but even compared to some other NES games, Metroid's level design is still lacking. Right away, we're met with many simple, empty hallways with enemies, basic, seemingly randomly placed platforms, and the absolute worst offender of all, repeated room layouts. This is easily one of my greatest complaints with this game. So many of the rooms are copied and pasted, incredibly basic, or both. There is seriously so little going on in the vast majority of the rooms in this game that I'm left with very little to say about many of the rooms themselves. Frankly, this makes for a repetitive and dull-feeling game a lot of the time. It hurts navigation a fair amount as well, because with so many rooms looking completely identical or very similar, it becomes difficult to account for your position within the world. Nearly every instance of verticality in Metroid falls victim to copy and pasting. Metroid's level design is basic compared to other games of the time, and especially when compared to any other Metroid game. It's unfortunate, but there are at least a few rooms that stick out as memorable to me for one reason or another. These rooms have at least something to set them apart from the many basic empty hallways with random platforms, and even that is worth appreciating when the rest of the world is so forgettable. The elevator rooms have these friggin' epic fake statues. There's these 4 pipes in the top of Brinstar, this bubble column room in Norfair, these giant blocks in Norfair, this fake floor in Ridley, this energy tank room in Kraid, the fake acid rooms, a good amount of Turian. That's about it. All of these rooms have some kind of unique layout that may or may not offer some kind of interesting platform challenge. There are actually a few unique rooms that stand out to me in the worst kind of way, such as this time-wasting pit in Brinstar, or this god-awful massive stack of blocks in Kraid. It's the only way out after fighting Kraid, and it's the worst. Aside from that issue, many of the rooms in Metroid have hidden pathways in the form of destructible tiles. The player must shoot or bomb out these tiles to reveal hidden pathways. Metroid as a series is sometimes criticized for supposedly being too cryptic and requiring the player to bomb every tile in order to make progress. In the case of Metroid on the NES, this game especially receives a lot of criticism for hiding critical pathways in cryptic spots. I wouldn't blame anyone for deciding to give up on this game just over this one bombable block right here in Norfair for its time-wasting and cryptic design. I want to take a moment to explain why I think this specific tile in Norfair is one such instance. So to rewind a bit, I want to again bring up Zelda. Zelda has its bombs, and players are encouraged to bomb anything suspicious. Bombing the correct locations will open hidden pathways, some required and some entirely optional. Players have similarly criticized Zelda on the NES for requiring the player to bomb every tile. But in this case, I'd like to defend Zelda and say that I don't think you need to bomb every tile just to beat this game. The critical component of these required bombable walls is that they are always somehow hinted to the player beforehand. Zelda has its map, which helps highlight where hidden rooms might be. There are also the occasional hints from NPCs, as well as suspicious level layouts with dead ends or notably unique level design. Zelda has numerous ways of hinting to the player about a secret path without outright telling them. If we compare this to something like these examples from A Link to the Past, these cracked walls directly communicate to the player exactly what needs to be done. Hinting something to the player without outright telling them about it has everything to do with how mechanically engaging bombs end up feeling. Communicating to the player some design language through something in the environment, such as a cracked wall, a boost ball spinner, a missile door, a spider ball track. All of these are not necessarily meant to be challenges in and of themselves all of the time, but the moment that an Ocarina of Time player spots a cracked wall, the solution is immediately identified. I don't think this kind of game design is necessarily good or bad on its own. The execution and implementation are what matter on a case-by-case basis. In the case of Metroid's bombable walls, I believe the game does well with balancing these ideas overall. Many secret blocks are hinted at with floating enemies or suspicious dead ends. Sometimes there are platforms that seemingly go nowhere that hint towards a destructible tile in the ceiling or wall, for example. This is all well and good, but the issue comes from the required instances in which there is quite literally nothing hinting at the possibility of a secret. Without Zelda's map, without a suspicious dead end, without locking the player into a small segment of the map, without any visual indicator, there is no possible way for a player to intuit the secret. These kinds of secrets aren't always bad, but they shouldn't be required in order to beat the game. This cryptic lack of hints is unique to this first Metroid game. I can at least give some credit and say that in Metroid, bombs are infinite, so the only resource spent is time, whereas in Zelda, your bombs are limited. The especially offensive instance of cryptic design is this part in Norfair, where a massive chunk of the level is hidden behind a bombable floor. This is the only outright required instance that I could find in this game. I don't think it's fair to say the game is full of this kind of design. You do need to go this way to get many upgrades, including high jump, screw attack, and also to get to Ridley. So you're not beating this game unless you happen to just randomly decide to bomb this one inconspicuous tile right here. I think they demonstrated a more ideal design for this kind of situation elsewhere in this game. A newcomer is obviously not going to know how many required pathways are so well hidden behind destructible blocks. So despite it being an isolated instance, I can totally understand players feeling like this alone is enough to demotivate them from wanting to explore this game. Metroid is telling its players that it does not value their time, and I believe dumb luck is the only way for a player to find this required path on their own. Reading the level design to intuit your own way through is a massive appeal of Metroid for many, and I feel like the designers are fumbling that here in this instance. How big of a deal this is will certainly vary depending on who you ask, but for me, it's really not a huge deal anymore. Some of us were lucky enough to find this without much trouble and hardly even think about it. Others outright dropped the game over being stuck and frustrated. Any number of tweaks, such as an in-game map or a more unique and suspicious level design, could have fixed this. Future Metroid games add things like a scan visor, power bombs, aiming down, missiles revealing hidden blocks, or scan pulse. But here in the first Metroid, your only choice is to lay a bomb directly on the tile, so it takes that much longer to find secrets in this game. I know that's a lot of time just discussing one tile of this game, but I feel it's important to lay the foundation of what I think makes for engaging discovery in a Metroid game. Obvious cracked walls can't be repeated too often, but secrets should not expect you to be bombing every tile in the game. Luckily, this is by far the most offensive example of cryptic design in the entire series. Nothing comes close in my opinion. We could compare this inconspicuous destructible tile to a similar one in Super Metroid to show you how to remedy this design issue. For one, any player that's downloaded the map will be outright shown that there is a room on the other side of this wall, and secondly, the player is restricted to a smaller area of the map with a one-way drop to assure that the player won't falsely conclude that they've hit a dead end. So the game has multiple ways to account for subtly communicating secrets without outright telling you. And this is well done before the player even gets power bombs and X-ray scope, which only further help the player find potentially cryptic hidden blocks. Super Metroid is absolutely filled with this kind of design, but I'll save the discussion about Super Metroid for its own video. For now, I'll just say that Metroid on the NES falls victim to numerous unfortunate circumstances that make the game feel more cryptic than any of the other games. So future Metroid games have numerous ways to account for assuring that the player's time is not wasted, whereas here in the first game, that is simply not the case. Again, this one block isn't going to affect you on repeat playthroughs, but it's certainly a beginner's trap. Combat feels like one of the more poorly aged parts of this game. Samus can shoot her arm cannon to either side or straight up, but later she could fire more beam weapons, missiles, lay bombs, and jump into enemies with the screw attack. The four beam weapons of the game are your standard power beam, which is short-ranged, the long beam, the ice beam that freezes enemies into platforms, and the high-damage wave beam. You make your selection by finding your beam out in the world, and cannot switch until you find a different beam. Samus can't crouch or aim down in this game, so you're forced to use bombs or wave beam to defeat any enemy beneath your arm. It's been said 1,000 times, but this needlessly complicates basic enemy encounters. Other NES games allow for you to aim downwards and diagonally, such as Mega Man and Contra, so it's a bit unusual for Metroid to decide to not allow this. Even your basic zoomers at the very beginning of the game prove to be quite the nuisance because you have to lay bombs each time you want to take one out, and nearly the entire world is absolutely crawling with them. You'd think this would make Wave Beam a no-brainer, but it's both difficult to find and useless against the Metroids in Turian. So by the end of the game, you have to find Ice Beam anyways. I don't even bother with Wave Beam because of this, and it'd actually be worth a damn if the beam's stacked like other games. But the missiles in this game are actually quite well implemented. These are a limited and powerful resource that can kill most enemies in just one hit. They're often required because they're the only way to open any door that isn't blue, and they are your only means of damaging almost everything in the final level. You'll need a ton of these to beat the game, but you can expand your ammo capacity by collecting missile tanks and defeating bosses. Self-explanatory, but a nice little layer on otherwise standard NES combat mechanics. The real standout ability here is the screw attack. When Samus somersaults through the air with this ability, her hitbox becomes damaging towards any non-boss enemy in the game, and will one-hit almost everything. The sound effect makes it especially satisfying when you effortlessly shit on those late-game spongy guys without even needing to stop. You're not invincible, but you are tremendously dangerous with this ability. The screw attack is such a satisfying combination of extrinsic and intrinsic value that it becomes one of Metroid's most iconic abilities. The only problem with it here in this first game is where it's oddly picky and inconsistent with when it decides to actually work, which can lead to damage through no apparent fault of the player. Samus's abilities in this game feel like quite the mixed bag, but the enemy design is where things feel more consistently simple. Most of the enemies in this game seem to not react at all to the presence of the player, even after you start damaging them. A lot of them will just crawl or fly around and just happen to hit you sometimes, like the Zoomers, Gamers, or Rippers. The fact that so many enemies behave indifferently to the player lends itself well to offering the choice to the player to simply avoid enemies. A few enemies, like Shriekbats and those giant flies, will dive bomb you when you get close, which requires pattern recognition and quick reflexes. Many of the rooms of this game will have these pipes, where some kind of beetle will fly right into you, again requiring pattern recognition and quick reflexes. Not much going on with the enemies, so combat ends up feeling pretty underwhelming. The real showstoppers of Metroid are the Metroids themselves. The Metroids are great because they are genuinely scary in presentation, narrative, and gameplay. These guys are outright immune to damage until you freeze them, and even then, they can only be defeated with 5 missiles. They don't stay frozen either, so you must act quickly and decisively. The moment that a Metroid is on screen, they will beeline for you very quickly. They aren't smart enough to go around platforms, but this often means that you have to jump down to them, and especially since Samus can't aim down, there's a calculated risk in advancing carefully to line up your shot. If you fail to freeze the Metroid, it will latch itself onto Samus and begin draining her health by the second. This unique way of attacking will immediately panic the player once they realize you can't simply shoot the Metroid away. It's obvious to longtime fans, but it's always a pleasure to watch newcomers panic and experiment with how to remove a Metroid. Simply laying a bomb is not enough to shake the Metroid, at least in this game. The bomb has to come in contact with the Metroid above rather than being placed on the ground where the morph ball is, so there's an extra layer of precision required from the player in this tense moment. Metroids are a standout enemy for several reasons, and they are by far the most well-designed and interesting enemy in the game. Unfortunately, the bosses are a joke in this game. To start off with Kraid, he just walks back and forth and shoots spikes from different parts of his body. Your only real strategy is to freeze the spikes and try to damage him faster than he damages you. There is quite literally nothing else for me to say about this bastard. I think the footage speaks for itself. Ridley is hardly any different. He just jumps up and down in place and spits fireballs in an arcing pattern. You're likely to get away with just standing right in front of him and shooting until he dies. These bosses are silly ass clowns. Fighting them is so simple that these encounters end up feeling more like rock'em sock'em robots than any mechanically interesting encounter. You are guaranteed to just trade blows back and forth until one of you dies, and that's all there is to these fights, really. Because of this, low percent runs are a total pain. I don't even want to bother attempting a low percent run just because of how these two bosses are designed. There is no opportunity for me to demonstrate my knowledge or skill against these bosses, so nothing short of game-breaking exploits is going to help you in a challenge run like low percent. Challenge runs are off the table for most people just because of poor boss design like this. Mother Brain is a little more interesting, and yet she does literally nothing at all. But what makes her unique is that her boss room is absolutely filled with turrets, lava pits, and the red rings. To even reach Mother Brain, you need to carefully platform around and dodge the many projectiles constantly flying towards you. These weird tubes are called Zebetites, and they rapidly regenerate health, so you need to focus fire with high DPS to take one out. There's 5 of these between you and Mother Brain, so you have to manage your resources for an extended period of time. Once you finally get to Mother Brain, all you have to do is continue to dodge the projectiles and be very careful not to fall into the lava pit in front of you. This battle genuinely challenges the player in a way otherwise unseen in this game, and stands out as unique even for the entire series. It's absolutely terrible that the Rinkas can't drop health or ammo though, because running out of missiles means your only choice is to die. And speaking of running out of missiles, it's time to discuss what many consider to be the absolute worst part of this game. So in Metroid, one immediate problem is that enemies in this game are very stingy with health and ammo drops. Unlike Super Metroid, for example, Metroid on the NES does not change drop rates based on your current health and ammo count. Enemies rarely drop anything, and even if they do, it can be something you don't need at all. You are likely to find yourself in a scenario in which you're full on missiles but in dire need of health. It's entirely possible and even likely that enemies will keep dropping only the occasional missile and continue to waste your time. Enemies cannot drop multiple health pickups, bosses can't drop anything, and the majority of enemies do not drop any health or ammo pickups worth more than 5 units. With all of this in mind, the worst is yet to come. Dying in Metroid does not simply send you back to a previous checkpoint. All of your progress is saved, yes, but unfortunately your ammo is not replenished and your health will always start at 30 units with none of your tanks filled. So if you die for any reason in this game, you are forced to grind for health in order to bring yourself back to fighting shape. This game does not have any healing stations or save stations either. Any missiles used attempting to defeat a boss, for example, must be grinded back through common enemies with low drop rates 5 at a time. At least in the case of energy, an experienced player can purposefully leave extra energy tanks around to instantly fill your health, but that hardly acts as a solution for this horrendously bad design. Punishing players this hard for dying has tremendous consequences on the player's motive to explore. Every moment of exploring Zebes in Metroid poses the risk of forcing you to grind upwards of 15 minutes just for dying a single time. Whenever I play this game, if I die, I either need to find an energy tank or just straight up restart my entire run. If I run out of missiles after beating any boss, the game is already over then and there. I've played this game countless times, and I decided long ago that I cannot stomach another grinding session. Luckily, I've become good enough at the game where death doesn't feel like a risk to me during normal runs, but it's completely absurd that this scenario can be so easily encountered by anyone. Newcomers are almost certain to frequently encounter this scenario, which means that they may not continue exploring until they finished all of their grinding every single time. Because the grind in Metroid seriously ruins the entire game for many players, I cannot blame anyone for dropping this game for that reason alone. Mega Man, Zelda, and Castlevania all start you with full health bars, and a lot of them have ways to instantly fill your entire health bar. Metroid not having this as a readily available game feature is not just aged poorly, but it's not even matching the standard of its time. I think it's pretty easy for me to forgive all of my other issues with this game, but this one seriously hurts this game and acts as the looming shadow over every moment of your playthrough. Smaller frustrations like getting hit during door transitions or the frequent slowdown are multiplied to infuriating encounters just knowing that death will cost me so much. It is for this reason that I recommend using save states if possible, or one of the improvement ROM hacks of this game. Since I don't know where else to mention this, yes, this game frequently allows enemies to damage you, possibly even multiple times during door transitions. This is especially common in Turian with these Rinkas that can and will damage you during door transitions, as well as spawn right on top of you. Combine this with other frustrations like the slowdown, repeated room layouts, extreme punishment for dying, the knockback, and this game can really infuriate you sometimes. Hidden throughout Planet Zebes, you can find 21 missile tanks and 8 energy tanks. Each missile expands your ammo capacity by 5. Anyone who has played Metroid knows how missile tanks work. The neat thing about these expansions is that they are integrated seamlessly into the main progression of the game. To explain what I mean by that, I'd like to make another comparison to Zelda. In Ocarina of Time, a lot of the side content is doing stuff like looking for bugs and fishing. Maybe you gotta play minigames or deliver some items to different NPCs. This is all well and good, and this kind of design certainly has its own merits. However, it's clear in Ocarina of Time that there is somewhat of a disconnect between the main quest and the side quests. The type of gameplay has completely shifted, and the player is well aware of the change. Metroid may not offer this type of variety, but there's a unique synergy with Metroid's optional expansions that comes from the exploration-focused gameplay. When you're exploring around in a Metroid game, even just trying to beat the game normally, you're naturally going to come across plenty of expansions as you search the world. Because the gameplay of searching for expansions is essentially the same thing as your normal exploration, there's a continuous gameplay loop in which the player is often rewarded just for playing the game normally. The side content is naturally integrated into the main gameplay in such a way that most players won't even really see this as side content. Searching around for all of these optional expansions is not required, but it's still a massively important part of the game. This offers a compelling complement to the main gameplay loop of searching and becoming more powerful. With that said, however, there are aspects of this design that end up feeling comparatively underwhelming here in Metroid on the NES. Here in this first game, the majority of the missile tanks will be sitting out in plain sight just waiting to be collected. A good number of them are hidden behind secret pathways and destructible blocks. A lot of them are also just placed out in the open right next to each other, such as this room in Norfair that has 3 tanks all in a row. If you've played the sequel games, then it becomes clear just how comparatively basic these missile placements are. They're not offensive or frustrating, but they do feel rushed and lazy. I can at least appreciate that missiles as a mechanic still have a profound effect on the gameplay overall. 100%ing Metroid on the NES doesn't have to be terribly difficult if you're willing to use an online guide, but outside of that context, I feel it may be among the least fun to 100% in the series. So some obvious stuff first, no map means there's no tracking which items you've yet to collect. This game game also lacks an item percentage display literally anywhere in the game at all, which means you're almost certainly going to need a guide. Accounting for and tracking your item percentage is pretty miserable, but the actual process of searching for pickups isn't so bad. As discussed previously, actually picking up the expansions is, at its worst, perhaps a bit cryptic at times. Random tiles in the ceilings, walls, and floors hide many of the expansions, so the completionist is going to have to spend a lot of time searching everywhere. Especially since the player cannot aim down, you're going to have to bomb many floors. This is the case because you have no other means of interacting with the world in order to track or uncover secrets, and a good number of them are placed in fairly obtuse locations. The few that are placed in these harder to find spots really aren't that bad, but the unguided player isn't going to know exactly where each of these are, nor how many they even need to find in the first place. I believe that 100%ing this game almost certainly requires a guide, because there are simply way too many questions left unanswered if you attempt to complete this game on your own. Going in blind, you don't even really have any way of knowing when you've collected every item. If you're following a guide or map, it's actually pretty easy to collect everything in just an hour or so and call it a day. Unfortunately, you kind of have to pick between this incredibly obtuse experience without any guides, or the very hand-holdy experience of following a guide to make sure you get everything. Neither really scratches that itch for me, and I end up feeling dissatisfied by the end. The best experience that you can try to have is to go into the game knowing exactly how many missile and energy tanks there are, and tracking your collecting yourself, perhaps on a piece of paper. See what you're able to find yourself, just knowing the totals. If you're able to go into this game knowing how many items there are, then you might actually have a great time searching around for as many of those as you can. When viewed from this frame of mind, I can say I actually quite enjoy attempting to collect everything in Metroid. Overall, however, I have to say that Metroid fails to communicate enough to the player to make 100%ing this game satisfying. No map or map markers and no item percentage are the two fatal flaws for me in this case. Metroid will give you 1 of 5 endings depending on how quickly you beat the game. Samus will appear in this one piece if you beat the game quickly enough, as well as unlock this as an alternate costume for Samus in-game. So the faster you are, the less clothes Samus has at the end of the game. For many, this is how players discovered that Samus is a woman. It's great to have Metroid reward the player for beating the game faster, but I'm not sure I like the reward. It just doesn't feel right to have your strong female lead stripped down to be oogled at as the reward. It's one thing if the fans decide to draw this kind of stuff, but to have it here in the games themselves is a step too far, in my opinion. I like getting to this screen because it means that I beat the challenge, but the actual reward itself has always felt strange to me. I think it'd be much better if Samus maybe had different outfits, poses, or actions depending on your ending. I like that she only waves to the player in the 2 best endings, and I think more of something like that would have been better. The Famicom version of the game will place 1 to 5 bags of money next to your save game depending on how quickly you beat your mission. Something like this is great for showing how well you did without demeaning your player character. Other future titles have found interesting ways to reward the speedrunner with unique art depicting other games, or maybe events from Samus's past. Here in Metroid NES, meanwhile, I can't help but feel a bit baffled by the way they went about rewarding the player. Unlocking the new costume is great, but everything else just feels like bad fan service. It could have been worse, but it could have been so much better. Aside from the reward itself, however, I believe there is tremendous intrinsic value in learning to beat Metroid quickly. It could be argued that for many players, trying to beat this game quickly is what repeat playthroughs are all about. What better way to show your mastery over this game's daunting and maze-like dangerous world than to beat it super quickly? Speedrunning this game requires a thorough understanding of the map, as well as an intimate familiarity with all of the game's mechanics. You need to know the most efficient route through the world at all times, and you need to execute in a precise and timely manner. The process of learning the world requires multiple playthroughs in which you need to carefully study and analyze the game world. Your critical thinking skills are put to the test to meticulously plan your route and make sense of the world according to your current arsenal. When all of the studying and map analyzing comes together, and you feel you've practiced enough to become proficient with Samus's moveset, it's time to actually try to speedrun the game. Executing on everything is a whole other story. Platforming becomes more interesting with the stress of hurrying as quickly as you can, and combat becomes more tense with a smaller margin of error. Less time to grab expansions means you can't afford to blast missiles and tank hits willy-nilly. Every expansion collected is a trade-off between time saved and resources available. It's a careful balancing act that you must plan for. Go as quickly as you can through your detailed plan, and execute on every little thing as best as you can. Speedrunning can make a lot of games endlessly replayable, but especially here in Metroid, it's interesting to see how the resource management and routing play into your speedruns. Especially with so many items being optional, it's up to you to figure out how many items you're willing to shave off in order to save time. Overall though, I have to say that Metroid really comes into its own when viewed from the perspective of a speedrunner. A lot of the issues that I've brought up with this game, like its unforgiving death penalty and occasionally cryptic progression, aren't issues for the player that has already mastered the game. I would argue that Metroid on the NES is at its absolute best when it's played by those who have already played it and learned about its many quirks. Nowhere is this better illustrated than here with speedrunning the game. Metroid on the NES, for all the criticism it faces, there are a few in particular that I will voice my disagreements with. For one, I have to recommend that everyone at least try this game. I don't think it's fair to say that this game is easily skippable, because it has a lot more going for it than just its retro appeal. I also strongly disagree with the notion that this game is nothing more than a proof of concept for the Metroid series. The Metroid series always comes in different shapes and sizes. A wealth of variation exists within this series, and I believe that Metroid NES's freeform simplicity makes this game stand out even still in the year 2023. I do agree that the game hasn't aged very well, but I don't think that means that the game is bad or that it's not a real game or not worth playing. It's a fully realized game with many fantastically designed aspects and some potentially fatal flaws. At the very least, I have to recommend that everyone try playing the game with save states or rewind features if they feel like they just can't tolerate the grind. I'd even recommend trying out the NAR password code if you're interested in just the exploration. I get it because that grind is awful. If save states and codes aren't your thing, then perhaps you should try one of the ROM hacks for this game. 3 that come to mind are Metroid Mother, which adds a minimap, revamped graphics, saving, beam stacking, and a wealth of other improvements. Metroid Plus Saving does very similar things, but without the graphical overhaul. Metroid Planets takes this improvement effort even further with a pseudo remake of Metroid NES, featuring new animations, new music, respawn with full health, item percentage, map, in-game timer, no more slowdown, a randomizer, a new game world loosely based on the original game featuring new level design and bosses, online co-op, a neat endgame progression tracker, various new modes including a hard mode, infinite bomb jumping, a level editor, turning equipment on and off, no sprite flickering, and more. I understand the value in the purist experience, but I felt I had to at least mention and recommend these hacks for those interested. Metroid Planets in particular is absolutely outstanding, and I urge you to try this with your friends if you can. Metroid is a divisive game for numerous reasons, and I hope I've done a good job outlining why that might be the case in this video. The game has an interesting premise and outstanding music, and the main gameplay loop is extraordinary, even still in 2023. I believe Metroid succeeded in its mission to combine Mario's action platforming with Zelda's interconnected exploration. This game had a profound impact on the game industry and shaped out its own massive Metroidvania genre, of course, but it also manages to be unique even when directly compared to all of the other games in this genre. Metroid is unkind to the newcomer, but it makes for a great experience to revisit and attempt to master. For all of its accomplishments, I believe Metroid does fumble certain design aspects like its presentation and performance. The controls are fine when they work, but there's a fair amount of jank that any player can encounter when playing this game, like the screw attack not working, the slowdown, or the enemies damaging you during door transitions. Metroid pulled off its unique gameplay from the very start, but it did so while also stumbling with repetitive and basic level design, as well as occasionally obtuse progression. The gameplay loop of Metroid is so addicting that I can't help but play and love this game anyways, despite its occasional issues. Many of the issues are easy to bypass once you've become especially skilled with this game, or if you're willing to occasionally peek at a guide. Nearly all of the issues are resolved if you're interested in trying one of the excellent ROM hacks at least. The improvement hacks of this game demonstrate that just a few small tweaks can have an incredible effect on the overall design of this game. Even if you hate this game, I think it's still worth appreciating just how a few tweaks can improve this game so much. The combat and platforming may be nothing special, and the 100% run might be needlessly convoluted, but the speedrun potential of this game is nothing short of outstanding. Many of these issues will bother some more than others, but you absolutely owe it to yourself to at least try this game out and form your own opinion. Metroid may not be one of my favorites in the series, but it's still a great game that I enjoy revisiting often. Even with its remake being one of my favorite games of all time, I still find plenty to enjoy about the original as well. I'd even argue that there are a handful of things that the original might do better than the remake, but perhaps we can discuss that when I someday get around to making a video on that game. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video analyzing Metroid. Bye, see you later! Smell you later, Stinky, bye!